Picture this. You're 12 years old, riding your bike home after a perfect evening with your friends, rolling dice and battling monsters in your favorite game. The streetlights flicker as you pedal through the quiet streets of your small town, humming your favorite song. Then, in an instant, everything changes. The world turns cold and dark, filled with floating particles and twisted shadows. A creature from your worst nightmares emerges from the darkness, and suddenly, you're trapped in a place that looks like home, but feels like death itself.
Welcome to the nightmare that is Will Byers' existence. For years, this kid has been dealt one of the worst hands imaginable in the supernatural lottery. From vanishing into alternate dimensions to being possessed by ancient evil entities, Will's life has been a masterclass in cosmic unfairness. But here's the thing. Something's shifting in Hawkins, and for the first time in what feels like forever, Will might actually be catching a break. You see, Will Byers isn't your typical small-town kid. While most 12-year-olds worry about homework and weekend plans, Will's been wrestling with trauma that would break most adults. He's the sensitive artist in a world that often mistakes gentleness for weakness, the quiet dreamer in a town where being different makes you a target. Even before his supernatural encounters, Will was already navigating the complicated waters of growing up as someone who doesn't quite fit the mold everyone expects. But let's start from the beginning, because Will's story is one of those tragic tales where everything that can go wrong absolutely does go wrong. Growing up in Hawkins, Indiana, Will was already dealing with enough challenges. His father had abandoned the family, leaving his mother Joyce to raise him and his brother Jonathan alone. Money was tight, really tight, and the Byers family lived in a modest house on the wrong side of town, where the paint peeled and the heat barely worked during those brutal Midwest winters. At school, Will faced the daily gauntlet that sensitive kids know all too well. The bullies had him figured out from day one.
They could smell his vulnerability like sharks sensing blood in the water. They'd corner him in hallways, knock his books from his hands, and throw around cruel words that cut deeper than any physical blow. Being small, artistic, and gentle in a place that valued toughness made Will an easy target. His love for drawing, his quiet demeanor, and his close friendship with other outcasts painted a bullseye on his back. The worst part? Will couldn't even find refuge at home. Joyce worked multiple jobs just to keep the lights on, leaving him alone for hours at a time. Jonathan was dealing with his own struggles, trying to be the man of the house while figuring out his own identity. So Will retreated into fantasy worlds, finding solace in games where heroes could defeat monsters and friendship conquered evil. Little did he know that those monsters would soon become terrifyingly real. Then came that November night that changed everything. Will was cycling home from Mike Wheeler's basement, still buzzing from their latest campaign, when the lights began to flicker. Not just the street lights, but reality itself seemed to stutter and glitch. The Demogorgon, a creature from a dimension that existed parallel to our own, had somehow broken through the barriers between worlds. And Will, poor Will, was in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. What happened next was beyond anyone's worst nightmare. Will wasn't just kidnapped or hurt, he was pulled into an alternate reality that mirrored his own world, but twisted it into something horrifying.
The Upside Down, as it came to be known, was like looking at Hawkins through a funhouse mirror designed by someone's darkest fears. Everything was cold, decaying, and covered in a toxic atmosphere that made breathing feel like drowning. For a week, Will survived in this hellscape. Think about that for a moment. A 12-year-old boy, alone in a world where the air itself was poison, hiding from a creature that existed solely to hunt and kill. He had no food, no clean water, and no way of knowing if anyone was even looking for him. The psychological trauma of that experience would have shattered most people, but Will somehow endured. He found hiding spots, stayed quiet when the monster prowled nearby, and clung to the hope that his friends and family would find a way to bring him home. But rescue came with its own price. When Hopper and Joyce finally pulled Will from the Upside Down, he wasn't the same kid who had vanished.
The toxic atmosphere had infected his lungs, requiring immediate medical intervention. Worse yet, something from that dark dimension had taken root inside him, like a seed waiting to sprout into something terrible. Will had been exposed to forces that human minds weren't designed to comprehend, and the effects would linger long after his physical recovery. The months that followed were a cruel joke played by fate itself. Just when Will thought he could return to something resembling normal life, the episodes began. Without warning, he'd slip back into that nightmare realm, experiencing visions of the upside down that felt more real than reality itself. His friends tried to understand. His family rallied around him. But how do you explain to someone what it feels like to have one foot in our world and another in a place where hope goes to die? These episodes weren't just scary, they were completely disorienting. Will would be sitting in class, trying to focus on math problems, when suddenly the classroom would transform into that familiar rotting landscape. The walls would peel away, revealing the dark sky and floating particles of the upside down.
His classmates would vanish, replaced by the oppressive silence of that other realm. And there, in the distance, he'd see the shadow of something massive and malevolent watching him with ancient hunger. Each episode left Will more isolated than before. How do you make friends when you make disappear into another dimension without warning? How do you date when you're carrying trauma that no teenager should ever have to bear? Will watched his friends move forward with their lives, while he remained stuck, tethered to a nightmare that refused to let him go. Then came the possession. And if you thought Will's luck couldn't get any worse, you clearly underestimated the universe's capacity for cruelty. The Mind Flayer, a creature of pure malevolence from the Upside Down, decided that Will's connection to that realm made him the perfect host. What followed was a battle for Will's very soul, as this ancient entity slowly took control of his body and mind.
Being possessed wasn't like the movies make it seem. It wasn't dramatic, head-spinning, and speaking in tongues. Instead, it was a gradual erosion of everything that made Will himself. His memory became cloudy, his emotions felt distant and muted, and worst of all, he could feel something else moving around inside his consciousness, like a parasite. The Mind Flayer used Will's body to spy on his friends and family, turning him into an unwilling weapon against the people he loved most. The process of exorcising the Mind Flayer was as traumatic as the possession itself. Will's family and friends essentially had to torture him with heat to drive out the creature, knowing that they were causing him incredible pain, but having no other choice. Imagine being 12 years old and watching your mother cry as she deliberately makes you suffer, knowing it's the only way to save your life. That kind of experience leaves scars that never fully heal. But here's where things start to get interesting, and why Will's story might finally be taking a turn for the better. After years of being the universe's favorite punching bag, Will BYERS is finally discovering something that's been missing from his life since that terrible night: his own voice. See, all those horrific experiences that nearly broke him, they've also given him something incredibly rare: a deep understanding of pain, survival, and what it truly means to fight for your life. And now, for the first time, Will's starting to realize that his sensitivity isn't a weakness, it's actually his greatest strength. Think about it this way. Most people go through life never really understanding what they're capable of surviving. They worry about pop quizzes and social media drama, never having their limits truly tested. But Will? This kid has stared into the abyss and somehow managed to crawl back out. Not once, but multiple times. That kind of experience either destroys you completely or forges you into something unbreakable. And Will, against all odds, chose to be forged. The turning point came when Will finally stopped apologizing for who he was. For years, he'd been trying to fit into boxes that were never designed for someone like him. The quiet artist, the sensitive kid, the boy who preferred creating to destroying. He'd been made to feel like these were flaws that needed fixing. But surviving the Upside Down taught him something crucial. Being different isn't a bug in his programming, it's a feature.
His artistic abilities, once dismissed as impractical daydreaming, became his lifeline during those dark months. When words failed him, when therapists couldn't understand what he'd experienced, Will could put pencil to paper and capture the indescribable horror of that other dimension. His drawings weren't just art, they were maps, warnings, and ultimately weapons against the darkness that had tried to claim him. He could see connections and patterns that others missed, translate the incomprehensible into something tangible. But here's where it gets really interesting. Will's connection to the Upside Down, the very thing that made his life a living nightmare, is now becoming his greatest asset.
He can sense when something's wrong in ways that no one else can. That hypersensitivity that made him a target for bullies, it now makes him incredibly attuned to the emotional needs of others. He's become the friend who notices when someone's struggling before they even realize it themselves. His relationship with his sexuality, something he'd been wrestling with in silence, finally found its voice too. Growing up in a small town where being different was already dangerous, Will had buried this part of himself so deep he almost forgot it existed. But surviving supernatural horrors has a way of putting regular human fears into perspective. When you've literally been to hell and back, worrying about what narrow-minded people think seems pretty ridiculous. The moment Will stopped hiding from himself, everything changed. His art became more honest, more powerful. His friendships deepened because he was finally showing up as his authentic self, instead of some watered-down version designed to avoid conflict.
Even his relationship with his family improved as they saw him emerging from the shadow of his trauma into someone stronger and more self-assured. And his friends, they've been watching this transformation with something close to awe. Mike, Dustin, and Lucas have seen Will at his most vulnerable, when he was literally fighting for his sanity. Now they're witnessing him claim his power, and it's honestly inspiring. They're realizing that the friend they thought they needed to protect is actually one of the strongest people they know. Will's story is becoming less about surviving and more about thriving. He's discovering that his experiences, as horrible as they were, have given him insights and abilities that most people will never possess. He can comfort others going through trauma because he's been there himself. He can spot danger before it fully manifests because his instincts have been honed by genuine life or death situations. He can create art that moves people because he's drawing from a well of authentic experience.
The bullies who used to torment him, they seem smaller now, their cruelty revealed as the pathetic posturing it always was. When you face down ancient evil and won, some teenager calling you names loses its sting pretty quickly. Will's developing the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're made of. His mother, Joyce, is finally seeing her son not as a victim who needs constant protection, but as a survivor who's earned his strength through unimaginable trials. She's learning to trust his judgment, to respect his insights, and to celebrate the remarkable young man he's becoming. Their relationship is evolving from caretaker and patient to something more like partners in understanding the strange world they've found themselves navigating. Even Jonathan is discovering a new dynamic with his younger brother. For years, he'd felt responsible for protecting Will from a world that seemed determined to hurt him. Now he's realizing that Will doesn't need protection, he needs support and celebration. The kid who used to hide behind his camera has grown into someone who faces challenges head-on.
But perhaps most importantly, Will is finally understanding that his story isn't defined by what happened to him, it's defined by how he's chosen to respond to those experiences. He's not the victim of the Upside Down anymore, he's its survivor and conqueror. He's not the weird kid who got picked on, he's the artist who transforms pain into beauty. He's not the broken boy who needed fixing, he's the whole person who always existed beneath the fear. This shift in perspective is changing everything about how Will moves through the world. He's making choices based on what he wants rather than what he thinks others expect. He's pursuing relationships that feed his soul instead of settling for whatever scraps of acceptance he can find. He's creating art that reflects his truth rather than hiding behind safe, conventional subjects. The supernatural threats that once seemed so overwhelming are starting to feel manageable because Will has developed something more powerful than any monster: unshakable self-knowledge and hard-earned wisdom. He knows who he is, what he's survived, and what he's capable of achieving. That kind of inner certainty is like armor against whatever darkness might come next. And for the first time since that terrible night when everything changed, Will Byers is actually looking forward to his future instead of just trying to survive his present. So there you have it. Will Byers went from being the universe's favorite target to becoming someone who refuses to be defined by his trauma. From that terrifying bike ride home to discovering his own unbreakable strength, Will's journey proves that sometimes the worst experiences forge the strongest people. His story isn't over, and honestly, for the first time in years, that's actually exciting instead of terrifying.